Have you heard of dopamine before, or dopamine pathways, but you're unsure what that really means? Especially if you have ADHD, this might be something that maybe has popped up for you. Or like dopamine decor, all of these like new terms. If you really want to understand what dopamine is, let's talk about that today. Or if you're a Psych NP student and you're hoping to learn a little bit more about dopamine pathways and actually retain that information in a way that like makes sense, let's talk about that today. So my name is Maria and I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I also have a passion for mental health education. So if you're here to nerd out, you're in the right place. Subscribe. I'll have more of this. And today we're talking about dopamine. So I'm really excited to talk about how dopamine works, the pathways, and how like medications and mental health diagnoses kind of wrap into this. So we'll go into that. What is dopamine? Let's start there. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. What that means is it's a chemical messenger in your brain that has a function. When we hear things like dopamine decor, usually that's associated with pleasure. We hear about dopamine in relationship to like drugs causing like, huge amounts of dopamine or addiction, things like that. So those are things that people commonly know dopamine for, which is true. It is implicated in those things, but depending on the area of the brain, it also has some different interesting functions. So a lot of our medications for mood and ADHD do focus on dopamine and kind of like altering it or balancing it in certain parts of the brain. So I'll talk about that. And then it has 4 different pathways. So it has the mesolimbic, mesocortical, I hate pronouncing these, nigrostriatal, I hate pronouncing these. I feel like no matter how long I'm in the field, I'm like, oh my God, I can't. And then the Tuberoinfundibular Pathway. And I'll go over each one of those. Let's start by talking about the Mesolimbic Pathway. This is something that starts in the VTA of the brain, or the ventral tegmental area. This is kind of the part of the brain that looks at like, what does your body need? And it uses dopamine to create signals for that. It can obviously missignal things, and then we're craving things and having different kinds of like signals from our body that we need things that maybe we don't, like drugs, food, addiction, things like that. Anyways, so this kind of extends out to your limbic system, like mesolimbic, right? Limbic and the amygdala. These are centers that are associated with pleasure, reward, emotions, and then also it extends out to your prefrontal cortex. This is where executive function happens. When I say that, I mean like planning, thinking, all of those things. Places that we have deficits for ADHD. Anyways, so dopamine, essentially like when it's in this pathway, an increase, you are running, you get a runner's high hit of dopamine, you feel that reward, right? That's a positive. It's a great thing. Like we can experience joy in life through that. On the negative side, if you're taking like cocaine, that's also a hit of dopamine. I guess like maybe not negative for some people, but like, in the long term, if you're using too much cocaine, that's probably negative. But that could be problematic. That being said, it is a prominent pathway implicated in addiction. So during any kind of like activity, whether it's drug use or like binge eating disorder would be kind of here too, the dopamine will spike. And then how this works is I want you to think about receptors in here. Like, let's break this down a little bit. Okay, let me back up. One of the things we have to understand when we're talking about neurotransmitters is something called downregulation and upregulation. So how I best understand this is like if we were to imagine a parking garage, right? So if we have like 4 different entrances to this parking garage, there are 100 spaces. Okay, 100 spaces for 100 cars. And like on a normal day, like a couple cars coming in and out, there's like 50 total and they're rotating. Maybe you get 100, they're kind of rotating in and out. There's never an overlap where there's too many cars in the garage and there's not enough spaces, right? So you can have all 4 entrances open and it's kind of like an easy in and out. That's a normal day. And then what happens is if you have too much of it, right? Like there's all of a sudden like an event that happens and now there's 500 cars in line and you have 4 entrances open and all of a sudden there's too many cars in here. The people who own that garage might be like, oh shit, hold on a second. Like let's close off some entrances so we can control how many cars are actually getting in here and make sure we can count and just only have that 100 because we don't have 400 spots. We can't be letting, hundreds of cars in at once. You just can't. It's not like a viable solution. So what happens is downregulation. If you have too much dopamine happening, your brain's like, oh, excuse me, too much. And then they start shutting off those receptor areas and they put in less receptors. Very similar to the parking garage. They're going to have less entrances open because there's too many cars. Too much dopamine. Let's shut off all the valves and just have one valve open instead, or a couple open instead of like thousands, right? On the contrary, if you don't have enough of it, you end up having upregulation, right? Like your brain is just hungry for it. And it's like, just give it to me. Give me anything. Like I'll take any car in this block. So they open up all the entrances just so like it can be visible. Like, here, pick our garage, just come in. Anybody come in. Like, we need you. So then like some car might see it and be like, oh, I'll come in here. And they don't want to miss any cars, right? So that's called upregulation. We have lots of doors open, lots of receptors open. So those are the two concepts that medications affect, one, and then like behaviors affect. So if you're doing like a ton of drugs and you get used to it, right? And your body's like, okay, this is a lot of cocaine, got a lot of dopamine coming in here all of a sudden, or like you start a new medication and you're getting more dopamine through that medication, your brain's going to start adjusting those receptors or those entrances, right, for that amount of chemical just to regulate it. That's actually where we get the effect of medication. So when you're like, why does my medication take so long to work? Why doesn't it just increase the chemical? It's not actually that causes the effect. It's like the receptors changing and like the valves changing. So those valves shutting off or opening, the receptors changing, that's what causes your effect. So that's an important concept. And I bring this up because in addiction, that's something that happens. We end up having like dopamine spikes and then downregulation happens. And then we're just having a craving cycle, also with binge eating disorder. So then like another thing that can happen with this, like schizophrenia, this is where we see positive symptoms in the brain for the dopamine pathway. So you see things like hallucinations and seeing things and hearing things and delusions and disorganized thoughts. All of that kind of stuff is because of an excess of dopamine in this area. If we have too much and you think about like it's affecting your ability to think and plan, it's affecting your emotions, it's affecting kind of all of those signals and things. So if you have like too much going on, it's like, I don't know how to process sensory information. There's too much things. Like I can't tell what's real. I can't tell what's not real. There's just a lot. There's too much. And then it starts creating things that do not exist. And then mania, bipolar disorder, also implicated with sometimes too much dopamine in this pathway, causing like a high mood, euphoria. If you think about doing like a ton of Coke, I've never done Coke, but I'm assuming it's like a euphoric feeling, right? So then you have like a euphoric feeling coming with manic episodes, risky behaviors, kind of like being a little bit more active and high energy. That can kind of come from this. If you don't have enough, sometimes that can be a part of depression. That's why we use medications like Wellbutrin, which would increase dopamine in these areas to help combat the depression. As far as like schizophrenia and mania, we use things like antipsychotics. These are dopamine antagonists or partial antagonists, meaning that they go in and they shut off that excess of dopamine, or they go in and just kind of balance it out. Things like Mounjaro and Ozempic, surprisingly, have a lot of like information as far as like Reddit and different threads, people saying like, oh my God, it's shutting off the food noise. This is incredible, right? What it's doing is it's actually affecting this pathway. This is the pathway that it's going in and saying like, hey, excuse me, we don't need all of this reward. And it kind of like numbs that out. And then boom, like food noise is gone and that addiction is gone. So that's why it's very beneficial, they think, so far in like addiction. I think it will be kind of like the future of psych meds, a future. And then stimulants are something that can also increase dopamine in this pathway. Okay, next pathway, Mesocortical Pathway. This is something that is from your VTA to your prefrontal cortex. Main things that this can affect would be cognition, motivation, emotions, executive function, self-awareness, memory processing, all of those things. So a few different diagnoses. This is very common in having like affected dopamine cause symptoms in. One would be depression. So if you have a dopamine deficit, it can cause anhedonia, which is the lack of motivation, the lack of joy. A lot of those like bleh feelings that you get with depression, or like, I just don't want to do anything. I don't want to get out of bed, slow thinking, all of that stuff is because there's a deficit of dopamine in this pathway. Medications like bupropion can be fantastic for that. Schizophrenia, very similar. You have the positive symptoms, which are in the Mesolimbic pathway, and that would be like hallucinations because it's adding something to the world plus positive. And then negative symptoms, which is like the lack of something, the lack of joy, the lack of motivation. This is because you have too much dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway for schizophrenia, and then not enough dopamine in this pathway, which is why it's really important that we don't have medications that just have one function of like, let's just reduce the dopamine. We have medications like Abilify or Latuda, which are partial agonists, which can actually, they go in and they say like, let's raise it over here and let's lower it over here, versus medications like Haldol, which just lower dopamine kind of everywhere and then cause worsening of like, I don't want to do anything, low motivation kind of thing. So that's kind of like a plus of using a medication like Abilify for medications instead of like some of the old school ones for things like this. Bipolar disorder, that's something else that we often see affect this pathway. So if you have too much dopamine, then we're having too much energy, too many like racing thoughts. We don't have slow thinking. We have like the total opposite, high motivation and just high impulse. And that comes from too much dopamine. And then when we have a depressive episode, it flips. And then all of a sudden we have low motivation. We have like very slow thoughts. We're not impulsive. We're just kind of crippled and just kind of in bed and not moving, similar to typical depression. Again, which is why medications like Abilify could be fantastic for bipolar disorder. ADHD, some of the inattentive symptoms are here, not the hyperactive ones, but the inattentive, like I can't remember things, I'm forgetful, low motivation, all of that here. We see stimulants improving that for a lot of people. Medications like Adderall, Ritalin. Another interesting thing that affects this pathway is PTSD, and that's something that's often not talked about. Oftentimes we think like PTSD, first line, SSRIs, things like Lexapro. Why is someone who has PTSD on an antipsychotic? I have found like throughout my career working with like a ton of trauma, sometimes they just don't work, right? Because SSRIs can actually in the long term start decreasing dopamine and cause like a blah effect, which is why you often see people who are on like Lexapro and Wellbutrin, because Wellbutrin is fixing that dopamine that Lexapro kind of like turned off, right, on the long term. But medications like Abilify can kind of like stabilize all of that. PTSD definitely affects dopamine and it's in this pathway. So things like poor memory, that fogginess that can come from it, like not being able to process memories. So if you have a traumatic event and it's very fragmented because of here, poor decision making, not being able to control your emotions, like the irritability, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, all of that stuff is because of this pathway. So having a medication that can affect this pathway can be very beneficial to someone with PTSD. It's thought that dopamine is actually another implication for like dissociation in this pathway. So we look at like this pathway helps us to interpret sensory information and like interpret the world around us, right? And like we're understanding things through our prefrontal cortex. So with dissociation, we lose the ability to have self-awareness and to like have awareness of our surroundings or like ability to process our memories. And that's all related to this. So sometimes antipsychotics can actually be helpful for that too. All right, third pathway, the Nigrostriatal Pathway. This one's associated with movement. So I always remember this one is the movement one because muscle striations and like ANP, striations, striatal. So that's just how I remember it. But anyways, this pathway is important for controlling and regulating movements, initiating, inhibiting like involuntary movements. So that way everything you're doing is voluntary. And dopamine essentially has like the gatekeeper function here. So it's kind of like helping to signal when movement should like start and end. There's also a balance between another neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, and dopamine that exists here. They have an inverse relationship, meaning that when dopamine is high, acetylcholine is low, and they kind of switch depending on that. We want them to be balanced so that way everything is just happening the way it should. When we have imbalances, we start having disorders and symptoms happen. So some of the things that can happen when there is an imbalance. So if you were on an antipsychotic, something like Haldol or a first generation, meaning that they like strongly block dopamine but don't do much else, or sometimes even with, things like Abilify, second gen antipsychotics, you can get akathisia, which is an internal need to move, which is so intense that a lot of people actually do become suicidal because it's like one of the most horrendous things you can experience. Tardive dyskinesia, which is an irreversible, permanent, involuntary movement. Often that could be like trunk movements. It can be like facial kind of grimaces, the tongue sticking out, lip smacking, kind of really uncomfortable movements that just don't go away. And this happens because of the dopamine being blocked so intensely that acetylcholine increases. This causes a lot of the movements that just don't stop. Parkinson's disease is also in this pathway. So if you even have antipsychotics, it can cause very Parkinson-like symptoms. So you can actually have that very similar shuffly gait because there's too much dopamine blocked in this pathway. But also just Parkinson's in general, you get kind of the deterioration of this, the dopamine neurons here anyway, and we just get that permanently. Another thing that can happen is EPS, and this is like kind of like a set of side effects that can happen from antipsychotics. Dystonic reactions, which are like muscle contractions. So if there's not enough dopamine and there's too much acetylcholine, we start getting these involuntary muscle contractions that are extremely painful. These all essentially occur because like the body becomes desperate for dopamine and it starts doing upregulation. So we start opening a ton of doors. And if we open a ton of doors, that's when these symptoms start to occur. Other disorders that can come from this, OCD. So when we think about OCD, there can be like the obsessive part one, where you're starting to like think about things obsessively, intrusive thoughts. But then there's also that component of needing to do something in response. Sometimes that is a motor action. Sometimes that could be something like pulling your hair out or skin picking. Sometimes that could be something like checking or the need to just like physically do something to counteract your anxiety that comes with that anxious thought, right? So the inability of dopamine to like gatekeep those motor functions is what's causing that to happen with this. Tourette's disorder and tic disorders also because of this pathway, because we can't inhibit those movements and then those movements start to happen. So antipsychotics can often be very helpful for tic disorders, Tourette's, and sometimes adjuncting OCD with a antipsychotic can also be helpful because it's helping the dopamine piece here. Things like Abilify can be really beneficial for that in some cases. Final pathway, the Tuberoinfundibular Pathway. I literally hate saying that because I feel like I'm always going to mess that word up because it's huge. I remember that this is the one that is associated with prolactin and milk and breastfeeding because tubes in the boobs. It rhymes, and like tubero, and then like I think about milk tubes in the boobs. I don't know, it helps me. And now you'll never forget tubes in the boobs. So this is the one that is associated with the hormone prolactin. It stretches from your hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So it kind of affects those functions. What happens for the person who is breastfeeding is you put the baby on the boob, the baby sucks on the nipple, the brain gets the signal of like, oh, hello, this is happening. Which is like specific to babies, not like random people sucking on your nipples, by the way. I feel like that's just different. I'm not sure how, but it must be. Anyways, so then the brain gets a signal and it's like, okay, we need to create milk. So it says, stop the dopamine in this pathway. It cuts off the dopamine. It says, okay, enough. And then from there, the brain gets the signal of like, okay, let's release prolactin. Prolactin is the hormone that's associated with milk production. On that note, what also happens with some antipsychotics, things like Haldol, things like risperidone, is they block dopamine too, right? And if we're blocking dopamine and it happens to block in this pathway, we're also getting milk production. So then you end up sometimes getting like large breasts, gynecomastia, which is like the development of breasts. There was lawsuits around risperidone because of this. It is something we like to like warn men because that can be irreversible. And then it's like kind of weird if a man is starting to like have milk production, or even if like you're just a human or a child and you're starting to have milk production, right? But there are a lot of risks with having high prolactin in general and having milk production, even if you're just like, I don't really care if I'm making milk. It can affect like your bones in the long term. It can affect your fertility in the long term, your period cycle, just in general, like sexual dysfunction, osteoporosis. Those are just things we don't want to do. So if you end up having a high prolactin level and you are symptomatic because of taking an antipsychotic, typically they put in another medication, something like amantadine or Abilify, or they'll move you over to a medication like Abilify. Abilify can actually decrease it. So sometimes they'll add Abilify in to help decrease the prolactin because it goes in and kind of balances things where they need to be because it's cool like that. But yeah, not the best side effect to have, kind of weird. All right, so today we've talked about the 4 dopamine pathways. So hopefully you have a better idea about what those do and how that relates to psychiatry, how that relates to medication and side effects. Other daily habits and things you can do can affect dopamine too, not necessarily just medications. Things like exercising and running and like sleeping well and having a balanced diet, all of that stuff also affects dopamine. If you found this video helpful, then you can hit like, subscribe, share, and look forward to some more videos nerding out on different topics. If you are interested in something and you want me to make a video on it, I'm down for it. Just leave me a comment and I'll work on it.